Salutations to the Truth Core, whoever or wherever you may be on the planet. This is once again yours truthfully, the main professor and founder of Nemeta, Sophianic School of Arts and Sciences. And I'm here with installment number 9 in Mythology 101. And the title is The Slave Species Meme. What I am doing in this talk is giving you a tour of a very difficult territory. I'm taking you into a morass of confused and cluttered material derived from ancient sources, and primarily from non-Semitic Sumerian sources. So remember that the Hebrew file is simply one file within the classification of Semitic mythology, which is a linguistic and not a racial classification. So the Sumerians did not use the Semitic languages. They used their own languages of Babylonian, Akkadian, Assyrian, Huranian, and dozens of others. The primary source materials I will be citing come from cuneiform, that's the American pronunciation, cuneiform tablets. They're called cuneiform because they use a stylus. They are written with a stylus that has the form of a triangle on it. And the root of the word cuneiform is C-U-N, which is actually the root of the word cunt. The association, of course, and this is the most ancient one, connects the triangle or the delta shape with the female body and the organs and form of the female genitalia. That is to say, the triangle with a point downward, contrasted to the triangle with the point upward, which is a trope for the male genitalia, in fact, the male erection. And when you superimpose these two triangles, you get something that is recognized today as the so-called, quote, Star of David, end quote. But as a matter of fact, that is a theft. The Star of David is a theft from ancient mythologies and ancient teachings, particularly going back to India, where the two superposed triangles, point up and point down, were the symbol of the union of Shiva and Shakti, the male and female principles of creation. That is also, obviously, a symbol of tantric intercourse. So what is the slave species meme? Well, it's quite a popular meme that has been treated in the works of such people as Zecharia Sitchin, Michael Tellinger, probably the two most well-known currently, and a third who is not so well-known but more significant than the other two. I'll get to him in a moment. How about if I start with a little personal anecdote? You know, I'm just a country boy from coastal Maine. And yet, the pattern of my destiny, which has been a complex one, has often included threads that led me to key people in high positions, in prominent positions. And even though my relationships to these people were tangential and momentarily, they were significant encounters. Let me give you an example. When I first came to Europe in 1991, due to the personal connections I had at that time, the only people that I knew were members of the nobility, the European nobility. or to use the French term, la noblesse. And so I knew members of the Belgian, French, German nobility, counts and countesses, even princesses. For a while I was a tutor to the ancienne princesse de Marode of Belgium, Philippine de Bouzies. During that period of my life in the early 1990s, after my book, The Seeker's Handbook, came out in March of 1991, these were the only people I knew in Europe, and that was more or less the situation. It was exclusively the situation for 3 years. Now, during that time, I had the occasion to live on the grounds of the European nobility. For instance, I lived in Lombise in the pavilion de chasse, the pavillon de chasse, which is the guest house of the Count and Countess de la Boissière-Thienne. So I lived on a domain where there was an enormous chateau, a moat, a deer park, the whole works. Subsequently, I had the opportunity to live in an area south of Brussels, which could be considered as the Bel Air or Beverly Hills of that region. And I lived in a place called Rixensart, or specifically a locale called Point de Jour, meaning daybreak. And just a mile or so from me, there was a place called the Lac de Jeanval. It was a small artificial lake. And on that lake, there is a large hotel, used to be a 4 or 5-star hotel. Now, during my studies in the 1990s, came to my attention that there was, at one time, a Bilderberg meeting at that very hotel, which I used to often pass when I went down to the lake for a stroll and a café au lait. And it so happens that I also learned that it was, I believe, at that particular hotel, at a particular Bilderberg meeting, that Zacharias Sitchin was one of the attendants. So Zacharias Sitchin is a key figure in the origin and development of the slave species meme. Starting way back when, I don't know, could have been, say, the late 70s, Sitchin produced a series of books, and there were many of them, I think 10 or more, in which he interpreted some texts of the Sumerian non-Semitic mythology, in particular, the legend of Gilgamesh and others. What Sitchin did was to spin that material in a particular manner. He interpreted, first of all, the Sumerian mythology of the Annunaki to be a scenario along the lines of Erich von Däniken, who wrote Chariots of the Gods. So the ancient astronauts meme, which was brought to massive public attention by von Däniken, was further developed by Sitchin. So Sitchin claimed that these records written on clay tablets contained the story of the interaction between an extraterrestrial species, the Annunaki, and humanity. And in that scenario, the Annunaki appear to be the overlords, members of a higher and more advanced civilization who came to Earth for the purpose of mining certain metals, according to Sitchin, and who not only enslaved the local population, which I believe was called the Lulu, but also genetically modified the indigenous population of the earth. And that is the origin, that's the seed idea, the seed concept of the slave species meme. Now I want to indicate to you that Sitchin, Zakaria, I don't pronounce his first name correctly, I can't bother to find out. Sitchin was an Israeli scholar who claimed to be adept in reading these ancient Sumerian languages, in reading cuneiform. Over the course of time, I have come to doubt that claim, and others have as well. So there is a significant body of evidence indicating that Sitchin was a charlatan. I can tell you for certain that some of the key points of his spin on the Annunaki narrative are totally wrong. I'll give you just one example. Sitchin practically based his entire interpretation of the Gilgamesh legend on one single cuneiform word, Shem. And he claimed that this word Shem had the form of a rocket. So it really meant a rocket from outer space, a spaceship of the Annunaki. And he claimed that the landing pad for this spaceship was the massive site at Baalbek in Lebanon. The legend of Gilgamesh, which I have treated extensively in my book, The Hero, Manhood and Power, tells the story of a Sumerian hero figure who went on a vision quest into the mountains of Lebanon. And he went there, the tablets say, in quest of his Shem, in quest of Shem. Well, Shem actually means, correctly, it means honor or prestige. It does not literally translate to the word spaceship. So right there in that single term, you see how Sitchin falsely claimed that he could translate Sumerian, several versions, Akkadian, Assyrian, I think, and that he used that false translation as the pivot of his entire narrative. And it gets worse. You see, according to an accurate scholarly translation, Gilgamesh, who was a warrior hero, went into the wilderness of the mountains of Lebanon to confront the monster Humbaba and to win his prestige or honor in battle with that monster. And this is a common motif or mytheme, as Mircea Eliade said, a common mytheme in world mythology, the contest between the hero and the monster. And so by winning that contest, Gilgamesh earned his Shem, his prestige, his honor as a warrior. Now, the Epic of Gilgamesh is a wonderful story. It also includes other mythemes and develops them in a beautiful and powerful and highly descriptive narrative. For instance, it includes the myth theme of Noah and the flood. You find the figure of Noah represented in Gilgamesh as Utnapishtim. Now bear in mind that these cuneiform tablets date from 4,500 BC. They are much, thousands of years older than the biblical myth of the flood in the Hebrew file. And they present an example of the already pre-existing material among the Sumerian peoples that was co-opted into Hebrew legend. There is practically nothing in the narrative of the Hebrew peoples found in the Old Testament that is not borrowed or stolen from some other mythology. However, those elements that you find in their mythogen that are unique to their mythogen are the ones that I have outlined previously concerning the Elohim / Archons. So, do you find the Archons in these other Sumerian myths in the same way and in the same role that you find them in the Hebrew file? No, you don't. So what the ancient Hebrews did is they took not only the material of their racial narrative, but also their language and the terms in their language from these other races, and then they constructed an anomalous narrative particular to themselves. Well, concerning Sitchin, as I said, it gets worse. If I recall correctly, what he does is he interweaves the story of Abraham with the Gilgamesh story, and he represents Abraham in the place of Gilgamesh. So it's Abraham who goes to Baalbek in order to receive orders from the command and control of the Annunaki who land their spaceships there. This is the deep background of the slave species meme. And I need to address that in order to get it out of the way. Of course, I can only do so in a cursory manner. It would take another series of 10 talks in order to clear up all this material, and even then there would be a lot of loose ends. Actually, I've already tackled this problem quite extensively in 3 talks on Nemeta under the title, The True Lucifer is Sophia. In those talks, I went into what I consider to be one of the greatest problems in investigating Sumerian mythology as it relates to Gnostic mythology that can be pieced together from the Nag Hammadi codices and other materials. So what you have in the problem here is a number of entities named, described in an ambivalent way, and if you try to identify who those entities actually are, it becomes extremely problematic. But let me tell you what the core of the problem is, because it relates to the imperative task of deconstructing the Annunaki scenario, which is another name for the slave species meme. So who were the Annunaki, who are named in various Sumerian myths, creation myths, and in the Enuma Elish and other works? Well, Sitchin claimed that the word translates as those who to earth descended. That again is not correct. It simply means the progeny of An, A-N. And An is the creator god, the supreme deity in Sumerian myth. Nevertheless, this trope, those who to earth descended, remains embedded in the Sumerian material. So what is the truth about that trope? Who actually were the beings who to earth descended? Were they an extraterrestrial species who invaded the earth and enslaved the population and genetically modified the indigenous peoples, as Sitchin claimed, and Michael Tellinger, I believe, follows that narrative? Or were they not? I assure you, they most definitely were not. However, as far as I know, I would be the only scholar in the field who makes the claim that I'm presenting to you now. In order to correct the narrative, you have to go into the home story, the fallen goddess scenario, which is the centerpiece and master narrative of the Magian order and later the Gnostics or Teleste. Now, according to that long mythological narrative, which you can find now in 9 episodes, free on the internet, if you go to SophianicMyth.org, an event happened prior to the appearance of the human races on Earth. And that event is called, I call it, the gender rift. However, that concept is not entirely of my invention. The gender rift is just another name for the separation of the sexes. And the separation of the sexes is, again, a worldwide mytheme. It's in Greek mythology and elsewhere. So what exactly happened to cause the separation of the sexes? Well, the fallen goddess scenario says that the Aeon Sophia, before she morphed into the earth, was actually positioned in the form of a massive torrent of luminous living plasmic force, a celestial serpent. She was actually located or hovering in a specific area of the third galactic limb identified by the constellation of the Stork, which is known conventionally as Monoceros. And there occurred an event due to the fact that the anthropic genome projected from the center of the galaxy was nested in M41 and is to this day nested in M41, which is the Orion Nebula, due to the fact that she was in close proximity to the nebula. There was a moment when her body of force, of plasmic aeonic power, rifted that genome. It tore apart the membrane of the genome. And the result was that there was a separation of the two genders inherent to the human genome. And Sophia drew into her own torrent of plasmic power, plasmic force, she drew part of the genomic constitution of the human species, the female part. And when she morphed into the earth, that female part was inherent to the telluric and material body of the earth. As a result, the first examples of the human genome, the anthropine species that appeared upon the earth, were exclusively women. And that is also not a trope of my invention. You will find that assertion verified in other mythologies, and you even find it verified, for instance, in the folklore of the natives of the Amazonian basin, in a book called The Three Halves of Inomosho by Cesar Calvo. One of the old sorcerers from the Amazonian basin laughs and says, we all know it's all kind of a joke. The first men were really women. So there are far-reaching clues that support what I'm telling you here. Now, as a result of the gender rift, the female side of the genome, the genetic structure that produces women rather than men, was incorporated into the material body of the earth. Well, then what about the male counterpart to that? Well, it remained in the Orion Nebula. So consequently, when the earth was formed, when Sophia morphed into the earth, women arose. They were of various varieties or strains, which I have identified as 5 strains, but primarily they were the arboreal nymphs or tree nymphs. The first women were actually trees, and they could morph between being trees and being women. There's also support of this in other mythologies, and in particular in the legend of Daphne, who turns into a laurel tree in Greek mythology. Due to this bizarre situation, there remained in the web, in the spider's web of the trapezium in the Orion Nebula, the counterpart to the Gaian women. And it so happens that over time, the male counterpart, it had been torn away from its female aspect, found its way to the earth. And this is the legend of the Orion men. So the Orion men came to the earth because they were drawn there because their other half was living on the earth, you see. And the story of the encounter between the Orion men and the Gaian arboreal nymphs is a tremendous episode in the prehistory of the human race. And in order to know about this episode and work it out and go into it and investigate it, you have to do 2 things. You have to do the groundwork in the study of the mythological materials that refer to it, and at the same time, you have to have the sorcerer's skill, the shaman's skill of accessing the phylogenetic memory circuits of the human species. Then you can investigate and compose the correct narrative. So, perhaps now, if you're following this development, and I assure you it isn't easy, you will perhaps have caught the connection. Those who from the sky descended upon the earth were not the Annunaki, considered as some extraterrestrial species invading the earth. They were in fact the male component of the anthropine species as it now presents itself on earth in the 2 distinctly defined genders. They were the male gender. Now, these Orion men appear under various names in other mythologies. They are called the Titans in Greek mythology. They are called the Asuras in Hindu myth. They are called the Nephilim, the cloud men. Nephilim means the cloud men. And they were called the Gigantes, the giants. And there is a passage in the Old Testament that refers specifically to them. And here it is. Genesis chapter 6, verse 4. Now the giants were upon the earth in those days. And after that, when the sons of God were wont to go into the daughters of men, they bore children to them. Those were the giants of old, men of renown. So this passage, which the Hebrews stole from Sumerian mythology, accurately describes how the Orion men interacted and eventually interbred with the Gaian women, the arboreal nymphs and other strains of women who were produced directly out of the body of the Earth Mother, by contrast to the Orion men who came from outer space, from M42. And the way they came, by the way, was on threads. And they descended through these filaments of plasma and found their way to their home base due to the cosmic attraction they had to their lost counterpart. So there you have the basic plot of the gender rift. You find a fragment of Sumerian myth that supports this narrative in the first line, often quoted, of the Enema Elish, where it says something like this: "And kingship descended from heaven," or "the lines of kingship descended from heaven." Well, these lines mean the threads, the plasmic threads, which the Orion men used to transport themselves into the terrestrial atmosphere. But it also has another meaning. It means the lineage of the great kings, the men of renown, who arose through the interbreeding of the Orion men and the Gaian women. You find another piece of evidence in the book of Enoch, where it says, "And it came to pass when the children of men had multiplied, that in those days were born unto them beautiful and comely daughters. And the angels, the children of heaven, saw and lusted after them, and said to one another, Come, let us choose wives from among the children of men, and beget us children." Now this line, this phrase, this one sentence, confuses the Orion men and the Archons. So the Archons do play into the narrative here. The Archons are the watchers of the book of Enoch. And there are places in the Nag Hammadi text which refer to this incident, but they describe it in a different way. Note that the book of Enoch asserts that the watchers, the angels in heaven, by which they mean the archontic forces, wished to interbreed with human women. They wished to. Now, according to the slave species meme, they actually did succeed in doing so in a manner. In fact, you hear today from David Icke and David Wilcock and many other people the claim that the Archons or Annunaki have interbred with the human species and produced the so-called reptilian lineage. But that is in fact not true. There is a reptilian lineage on Earth due to the archontic infection. But it is due to a hack that the Archons accomplished into the racial vector that they selected so that they could penetrate into the divine experiment on Earth. It is not due to an actual interbreeding with human women. Another name for the watchers that comes from actually Slavic materials is the Grigori, which slurs into the word egregore. So there are two parallel threads of narrative here, and they tend to be confused. But if you want to clarify the story, you go to the Gnostic materials, because the Gnostics were aware of all of this. They looked deeply into the prehistory of our species, and they knew about the wish and the attempt of the Archons to interbreed, but they asserted that they did not succeed in that attempt. So I cite directly from the hypostasis of the Archons. The reality of the rulers is sometimes the translation of the title of that document. Quote, "And the Archons became attracted to Eve, the primal woman. They said to one another, Come, let us sow our seed in her. And they pursued her. And she laughed at them for their witlessness and their blindness. And just within reach of their clutches, she turned into a tree and left before them a shadowy reflection of herself." End quote. So you see, there you find in the Gnostic materials a direct refutation of one of the primary claims of the slave species narrative. And that's not the only one, but of course I can't elaborate further due to the limitations of this talk, which, by the way, is going considerably beyond the desired limit, but I will stick with it and try to bring it to a satisfactory conclusion. In doing so, first, I want to cite something from Occidental Mythology by Joseph Campbell. Quote, "It is to be remarked that one of the chief characteristics of Levantine mythology, here represented, is that of man created to be God's slave or servant." Now that statement just needs a little teeny bit of clarification. Slavery is an institution that has existed around the world in all times and all places and still exists today. As a matter of fact, it is the white races who have done the most in historical times to eliminate the practice of slavery. But slavery of one race by another, the enslavement of one race by another due to territorial conflicts, which are natural and inherent in this experiment, is not to be confused with slavery to God. So what do you find in the Hebrew narrative? You find a split of the human race into a superspecies, the Adamic race, produced by the Elohim or Archons. And the Adamic race stands above all the other races of Inushut, all the nations, the Goyim. So the Adamic race is the master race. The Hebrew file is the source document of race supremacy. It was and always will be just that. And according to that mythology, the creator god, who is Eldabaoth, the Lord Archon, the demented alien, entitles his people, the Adamic race, with the task of enslaving all the other races. Can you see that? So if you buy into the slave species meme, you are actually adopting the mythogen of the Hebrew, and there's no way to get around it. What you see today with the Quantum 19 event and the fear and terror that it brings upon the world is the final chapter in the enslavement of the human species, according to the mythogen of the ancient Hebrews, who are the racial vector of the Archons. By the way, don't assume that they have interbred with the Archons. There has been no hack into the human genome. There has been a hack into the human neurological circuits. The explanation and description of how that occurred and when it occurred is a matter to which I have given close and meticulous attention over many years. So finally, where can I take all of this? How can I round it out in a satisfactory way? One more point I would like to make concerns the concept of theocracy. Now, theocracy is a social and political system based on the assumption that those who control and rule the system are descended from the gods. That is the claim of theocracy. What you find in the Hebrew file is a bizarre, anti-human, and anomalous version of theocracy. In that narrative, which is the present-day culmination of the Hebrew mythogen, the corona is the crown of the theocratic kingdom of David. So when King David is crowned in Jerusalem, the Hebrew mission to dominate the peoples of the world, to possess the earth and the wealth of all the nations, and either to enslave or destroy the nations according to their will have been fulfilled. That's what they're going for. That's what you're up against. So finally, bear in mind that there did exist theocracies in the ancient world in Mesopotamia, and there were Sumerian theocracies in many different places in that part of the world. But those theocracies were established on a different basis than the theocracy that is unique to the Hebrew mythogen. Finally, I'll close with a little anecdote. I said at the beginning, there is a third author who is propagating the slave species narrative. As far as I know, less well known than the others. Once again, I could introduce a little anecdote from my life in Belgium. At that time, I had an asset. He used to work in the Palais de Justice in Brussels as a reporter. And at a certain moment, he went freelance. And when I met him, his name was Alain Gossens, he was investigating pedophilia among the Belgian nobility. And he was focusing on the case of Marc Dutroux, which happened while I was living in Belgium. It was an abduction of two young girls, Julie and Melissa, who died in captivity. It shocked the entire country and, in fact, shocked the entire world, and it brought to the forefront of public attention the evidence that there are hideous crimes of satanic child abuse and child sacrifice perpetrated by the global elites. Well, Alain, who, sad to say, was said to have committed suicide at the point where he was in the midst of researching these events, cued me to a young man living in Paris. His name is Anton Parks, P-A-R-K-S. And at the time that Alain told me about him, he was living with his mother in Paris, and he was deep into reading the cuneiform materials. Now, I do believe that he is a self-educated scholar, and that I do believe that his reading and translation of these materials, although self-taught, is probably more accurate than Sitchin. So if you go look up Anton Parks, you'll see that he is an author. And what he has produced is a series of books, 5 or 6, elaborate narratives based on Sumerian mythology, in which he develops and extrapolates the legend of the Annunaki along the lines of Sitchin and Tellinger. And he goes much, much farther with it than they did. Now, curiously, if you search Anton Parks, as I did this morning, you may come up with a page that shows the covers of all his books and gives a synopsis of the unique fictionalized version of Sumerian mythology that he is developing. Curiously, you find at the bottom of that page a photograph of myself and a reference to me as another Gnostic scholar dealing with the same materials that Anton Parks develops in his books. It's also important to note that Anton Parks was influenced by someone called Joseph H. Blumrich, Blumrich, who was associated, wait for it, with NASA, and who wrote a book called, I believe, The Spaceships of Ezekiel. So with Blumrich, from whom Anton Parks drew inspiration, you have yet a further iteration of von Daniken's scenario of ancient astronauts and spaceships of the Annunaki. And all of that is largely fictional, although if you go and read closely into the Sumerian materials, you do find genuine and veracious threads of narrative which refer to events that did happen in prehistory. To undertake this investigation, of which I'm giving you a glimpse here, in a thorough and adequate way, you would have to pull out the Sumerian file of numerous non-Semitic myths, place it on the table beside the Hebrew file and the Sophianic file, and you would have to triangulate between the material in those three files to work out some accurate and verifiable threads of narrative. Enough said, and I'll be seeing you in the beauty to come.